Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this gallery talk. My name is Yechen Zhao. I'm the Marsha Brady Tucker Fellow in the Department of Photography here.
And my name is Danielle Rod, and I'm the Coleman Payson Fellow in Academic Affairs and Outreach in the Education Department.
So today we're going to talk about an installation that just opened at the gallery last Friday called Systematic Thinking. It's a selection of works from the Department of Photography's permanent collection. And it's a thematic grouping that one addresses a kind of multifaceted way of working that's shared by photographers across the history of the medium. And two, really links up with some specific scientific principles and strategies in science education. So it is a collaboration between curatorial and education, and the keystone for this collaboration is really the word system and its different applications. What I mean by that is really like, how do photographers work systematically? What kind of systems overlay photography? And is it possible really to think about photography as itself a system that isn't just some kind of mirror of reality, but a symbolic language of its own?
So the first work that we'll get together is this large grid of 16 images by the American conceptual artist Mel Bochner, whose work in different media has examined language, measurement, and other modes of symbolic representation. This work is titled 12 Photographs and 4 Diagrams, N+1 Center Sets, and the photographs were taken in 1966 and 1967. So on the top row here, we have a set of grids within the grid. We have tables filled in with number patterns that follow a progression increasing from left to right. And what Bochner did was he had this set of wooden blocks that were 2 inches on each side and painted black, and he stacked them according to the numbers on the diagrams. So each filled in square corresponds to 1 to 4 stacked blocks. And he created the 4 structures according to the 4 diagrams, which correspond to each of the 4 columns that we're seeing here. And Bochner hired a professional photographer whose name is Gretchen Lambert to take the photographs of these block structures. And they photographed them from 3 different vantage points that are borrowed from architectural drawings. So the second row is the plan, so the top, so kind of like bird's eye view looking down, line of sight being perpendicular to the floor. The third row is the elevation, so the side or facade view where your line of sight is parallel to the floor. And then the bottom row is perspective, coming in from a diagonal axis. So each column is the same structure, but from 3 different angles. And Bochner used the same set of cubes to assemble all 4 of these block compositions. So they never actually existed at the same time. And he doesn't consider these 3D models to be sculptures in their own right. Rather, they're just steps in the process of making this overall ordered system.
In a kind of art historical context, it's really antithetical, I think, to expectations of art photography and art. This is, late 60s. The fact that Bochner didn't take the pictures but hired someone else, that they kind of look like drawings and not photographs, at least to me gives a feeling that I'm looking at a textbook or like a diagram in an instruction manual. It's not a quote unquote beautiful picture of a beautiful thing, and it doesn't have a reality effect like you would expect of a lot of photographs, but a kind of anti-reality effect. It's something that exists like outside of our world or our everyday experience. Danielle, could you talk about how the individual images in the grid relate to another?
Yeah, so what I love about this work is how it challenges you to decode the system, to parse out the relationships between each row and each column. What struck me after looking at this for a while is the 4th diagram. So all the way in the top right corner, it doesn't follow for me from the 3rd diagram. So moving from left to right, these numbers start filling into the grid in a way that seems logical, but the jump from the 3rd to the 4th grid, some of the numbers change and are increased and others stay the same. So it's all very symmetrical, but it is rather arbitrary. The block constructs follow from the diagram, so the overall composition is systematically executed and appears to be quite objective, but it is based on almost arbitrary arrangements. Bochner titles this with N+1 center sets, but that doesn't offer much in the way of explanation, but it does help to differentiate this work from other structures in similar grids that the artist has made. The 3 different views also, they presumably help us visualize the 3D structures in two-dimensional space, but I think they can also confuse the viewer. It's not immediately obvious that some of the photographs are different views of the same construction. I think especially if you compare the top view and the side view, it's not obvious from first glance that it's the same object from a different angle. And if you look at the two images in the third row, the two middle columns, they look almost identical. You can't really tell from the side view that they're the same object. It's really clear when you compare the top view, but they look the same from this side because of the arrangement of the blocks. You can tell that they're different photographs by looking closely. I can see that subtle differences in lighting and in the grain of the wood. So even though Bochner tried really hard to make these block structures seem completely abstracted, like you mentioned, Yetchin, there are these subtle clues that these are photographs of physical objects, like the grain in the wood, as well as some of the shadows that we can see cast by the structures. So Yetchin, we also have a text-based work by Mel Bochner in the case opposite the grid. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I would absolutely love to. I like this work a lot. This is called Misunderstandings, Parenthetical Theory of Photography. And it's not, there is a photograph in this case. It's a set of offset cards that fit into that little manila envelope there, but they're quotations about photography, these kinds of aphorisms. So you have like Hippolyte Taine, who was a French historian of the 19th century, or like Marcel Proust, as well as like Mao Zedong. And I think what is great is that it just shows that people's understanding of photography from the 19th century onward is really full of contradictions. Favorite one of mine is by the poet Emile Zola, who says, you cannot say you have thoroughly seen anything until you've seen a photograph of it.
And my favorite is a quote by Encyclopedia Britannica that says, photography cannot record abstract ideas, which I feel Bochner pretty readily dispatches with the 12 photographs and 4 diagrams grid that we just looked at.
Yeah, I mean, with that comment, I would want to move to another grid that we have in the installation. This is a work by the artist Sherry Levine called After Stieglitz. So just to be clear what these are digitally pixelated versions of a different photo series by an earlier photographer, Alfred Stieglitz. Levine, for people who know, is very famous for rephotographing, essentially just, copying wholesale the photographs of other canonized male photographers. This is most famously she did with Walker Evans, but this work is from 2006, and it adds an additional layer of mediation. So what she's done in this case is to use digital technology to pixelate them to an extreme. It's useful to know that the original series Alfred Stieglitz made is called Equivalence, and they're photographs of clouds that he made in the 1920s, which he expressly wanted to use as an argument to prove that photography can make abstract art. So it's a kind of way to, both carry that on, but also make some commentary on authorship and originality in photography. But with that, I want to move to another work that, kind of deals with history in a different way, not the history of photography, but more like, public history.
Yeah, so this work that we're looking at is by Leslie Hewitt. It's part of her series Riffs on Real Time, which she made between 2006 and 2009. And to start us off looking at this work, I'm actually going to invite participation from the audience. So if you can take a moment to just look at this object, and I'll invite you to comment in the chat box short descriptions of what you see in this image. So you can feel free to focus on one particular component that's drawing your eye, or something overall, but we'll pause for a few moments to give you a chance to look at this object, and please feel free to type what you're seeing in the chat, and we will read those out loud in a moment. So the question was, to just comment on what you're seeing in this image that we have up on the screen. So to write a short description of something that you see or that you notice in the image, and to type that into the chat. And we'll start reading the comments that we're seeing coming in, but please feel free to continue to type in your observations into the chat. So I'm seeing a couple of people commenting on the rainbow, that there's a rainbow that is painted on the side of a subway car.
Sorry, Danielle, it's hard for me to open the chat and also share the screen. So if you can read them.
Sure, yeah. So there's other comments about the squares, kind of concentric squares, a couple about windows, seeing real and fake windows. Also, people are noticing that there's different forms of transportation: ground transportation, air transportation, a subway car, a bus, people waiting to get onto a bus. Modes of transportation look like they could be from the late 70s, with bustling city traffic, with cars and buses. And people are also picking up on these layers here. So there's some kind of inside and outside, and then 3 different stacking layers. So there's a snapshot in the center that's a smaller image that shows people in a plane stacked on top of another image that looks like it's from a magazine or maybe a book, and it's on a blue background. Thank you all for your participation. There's a lot coming in.
Shall I give away the game and explain how it's made?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are 2 of these in the exhibition. This is from Leslie Hewitt's series, Riffs on Real Time. Leslie Hewitt got her MFA here at Yale. And this is a series that she made. She started, I think, while she was a student. But there is a very specific and compositional order that she has for making these works. This is a series I think she did over 6 years. But she's layering different kinds of imagery. So there's both vernacular imagery, like mass media imagery, and then she photographs the whole thing on a backdrop of carpet or hardwood, some kind of domestic interior. And I noticed people mention that, oh, the top layer feels like a snapshot. That's absolutely right. The topmost layer is always this kind of like personal thing that feels like a family picture or like a candid tourist picture. And then the second layer tends to be an image that comes from something in mass circulation. So it could be from a school book, a magazine cover, and it's often related to Black everyday life or specifically imagery from the 1960s civil rights movement in America. And then the final layer is always a domestic floor. And for Hewitt, these are works that are kind of both about collage. There's literal collaging here that takes place, but then also about still life. And so the title Riffs on Real Time refers to her interest in kind of talking about the relationship between history and memory and how the passage of time, affects our experience of that.
Yeah, so we have these photographs by Leslie Hewitt hanging next to 4 small Polaroids by Walker Evans at the left in the photo here. Yechen, what's the relationship between these sets of works?
So Walker Evans taught at the School of Art in the 70s for a few years. He was the director of the photography program. He has a legacy here, but with the Polaroids, actually, he got an unlimited supply of Polaroid film from the Polaroid Corporation, and he was kind of an obsessive picture taker, not, even when he was doing black and white, but especially with Polaroids. Some of his students will talk about how they would go over to his house and sit on his couch and it would just crinkle because the couch was stuffed full of these things. But you can't really see them here, which is why it's great to go look at them in the show. But they're often like really kind of everyday things. The ones that are in this picture are like buildings or like a dressmaker's form. And the reason why we put them together is because Walker Evans would often photograph the same thing, different times of day, or from a different angle. And he's also kind of engaged in a sort of like, collecting practice, photography as collecting memories or like building a history for yourself. So, that is also kind of a way of, I don't know, collaging together images to make something of a history. But to move on, I want to talk about a different kind of collage, which doesn't deal so much with maybe personal memory, but with the landscape.
Yeah, so this wall, this final set of works in the installation that we're going to dig into today in this program is this wall of landscape photographs. So at right, we have an image from the series Yosemite in Time by Mark Klett and Byron Wolf from 2004, which is called View from the Handrail at Glacier Point Overlook, Connecting Views from Ansel Adams to Carleton Watkins. And like Sherry Levine, Klett and Wolf used photographs by canonical artists, in this case, Ansel Adams and Carleton Watkins, in their own work. And we've paired them with photographs by Adams and Watkins in the permanent collection. A photograph from Ansel Adams is at bottom left here from the 1940s, and then on top of that is an image by Carleton Watkins from the 1860s. So the image that we have by Klett and Wolf, it's part of a multi-year rephotography project. Yechen, can you tell us about the practice of rephotography?
Sure thing. So I'm showing a larger image of the Klett and Wolf just so you can get a sense of what it looks like. A lot of people who have studied 19th century American history will know that the landscapes of the Western United States were subject to just this enormous campaign of image making for scientific, commercial, and political reasons. This was like a post-Civil War project. These were federally funded expeditions to cover this territory. And what that really ended up being was like photographers, painters, draftsmen were either making money or paid by the government to essentially like tame in this kind of domination way, tame this territory by turning it into pictures that people could consume in books, in periodicals, in stereo cards, and on the wall. And Mark Klett and Byron Wolf, who both teach at universities in the West, are obviously hyper aware of this. And so they have been investigating the overrepresentation of these landscapes and like the particular way of representing them by visiting these sites with their cameras and integrating their views with these historical views. So this example uses photography, but they have in recent years also used paintings and drawings. And I'll say that the original survey photographers who, quote unquote, mapped the West or whatever, they were working alongside geologists, cartographers, seismologists, and other kinds of, scientific observers to very clearly impose a system of measurement and analysis over the land.
Yeah, so rephotography seems to me also an embodied practice as much as a visual one, where these photographers will go and try to stand in the exact same location at the exact same time of day and time of year as a photographer of the past to shoot the same image, where they've done a lot of calculations about where this would be. But from what I've read, there's a lot of trial and error and hiking around and trying to put one's body in the same place as photographers previously did. And so Klett and Wolf, they collaborated on this Yosemite in Time project with the writer Rebecca Solnit, and they all three worked together to find these exact locations where photographers like Adams and Watkins took their images. Klett would operate the camera, Wolf measured the distances and calculated angles, and Solnit would write. And they published a book about the project, which includes essays by Rebecca Solnit. And she writes about the process of discovery in one of her essays. And she says, quote, "Not discovery of the untouched and truly unknown, but of traces of histories, conjunctions, overlaps, patterns, meanings in the steep, intricate, hallowed, scarred landscape of Yosemite." So Yosemite's photographic history is part of its landscape, and their project explores this double terrain, as she calls it, or this slippage between reality and representation. And when I say landscape, the concept of landscape, I'm not referring to the physical realities of the world, but the ways in which humans think about and see the world. So the lens through which we are looking at the land. And landscape holds all of these different values that various groups of people map onto the land. And visual representations of the environment, like photographs or paintings, they can reflect these values and even shape them. So this composite image, it shows how views of Yosemite have become quite standardized. But I love at far right, you can see some tourists or hikers in the image. And Solnit writes that they prioritize a quote, fidelity of place over fidelity of composition. So their reluctance to crop out and to frame these images clue us into the fact that there might be omissions in these historic works as well. So this image, it involves rephotography, but also panorama, it shows how close Carleton Watkins and Ansel Adams were standing like the same locations at different points in time. So Yichun, can you share a bit more about the work of Watkins and Adams?
Yeah, definitely. This is a spread from the actual book itself, which I highly recommend. I'll just say as well that Rebecca Solnit has a wonderful book about the Civil War era photography called River of Shadows, which I highly encourage anyone to check out. This is the spread comparing an image by Ansel Adams on the left to the collage on the right. That's the image that they're drawing on. And just to speak about Ansel Adams, I feel like maybe, 20, 30 years ago, it was like commonplace to say, if you're a good photographer, you're trying to be like Ansel Adams. But, he's known for chiefly photographs of the West and especially Yosemite, these kinds of beautiful black and white images. Ansel Adams was also very famous as an instructor of photography. He had his own system called the zone system for determining exposure, for how you would develop your pictures and how you would print. So he set expectations, not just for like how Yosemite should look, but how a beautiful image should look. And they're really tied together now with his work, because the photographs he made of Yosemite, they're collectible, they're very popular, they appeared in books, you could buy prints, but they really set up this kind of expectation that Yosemite is this beautiful untouched place. And so, that's what leads to an uptake of his photographs in the environmentalist movement of the 1950s and onwards, where there's this idea of, leave no trace, or, we have to preserve these places by limiting as much as possible not human habitation, but travel too, which is, actually been recently relevant because of the huge increase in travelers to national parks since the beginning of the pandemic. I'll move on to Carleton Watkins here, who is a little prior to Ansel Adams. So if Ansel Adams was working, 40s, 50s, Carleton Watkins is about 80, 90 years before that. He's in California in a much different time. And Carleton Watkins is actually really influential in getting Yosemite kind of designated as a protected place by the federal government. He is living in California in the 1860s and actually first gets the money to take pictures in Yosemite by a private funder, but then joins something called the California Geological Survey, which pays him to make the photographs of Yosemite for a book. In a lot of ways, he lays some of the groundwork for what Ansel Adams would do. He's figuring out the spots to go to. Like when I first pulled this image up for Danielle, she thought that it was the Ansel Adams picture, and it just really demonstrates how similar and standardized these images are. But Watkins, I think, unlike Adams, he was chiefly trying to do it for commercial reasons. Like he had a gallery in 1860s. He wasn't, tied into any kind of environmentalist movement because there wasn't one. But, he was just trying to make beautiful pictures of Yosemite and, kind of highlight his own skill in doing so. And I'll just highlight the fact that, Watkins's pictures are made with glass negatives, which are really big. He used mammoth plate negatives, which are like 20 inches in size. And he would have to bring his cart with his horse up the mountain, shoot the picture, and then develop it right then and there. So it was a very different model of working, but you can see the kind of lineage between Watkins and then Ansel Adams. Danielle, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I think it can go into the next slide, but the works that we have at left, so at the top, I mentioned it's the Carleton Watkins, and this is a photograph from Cape Horn taken in 1867, which is not in Yosemite, but another part of the Sierra Nevada. And the Ansel Adams beneath it was taken in 1946, and it is called Tenaya Lake Mount Conness, which is indeed in Yosemite. And I want to mention that these types of images that present this wilderness, untouched wilderness, like you mentioned, Yichun, of the West, they do serve to entrench myths of native erasure. So they present these landscapes that don't really have any people in them, or show or any evidence that people have lived and have been living there for quite some time. And the title of the Ansel Adams print that I mentioned, which is showing Tenaya Lake, is the name of a lake that was named after a native chief, a native leader that was forcibly removed from that land. And the lake was named after him, even though he refuted that name. He didn't want it named after him because the lake already had a name. It was called Piweok. And so that's something that we acknowledge in our label here so that we don't further entrench this narrative that by just presenting the title of the work. And I also want to mention that in the book by Klett Watkins and Solnit, we're showing an example of a panorama with photographs kind of collaged onto it, but they also have side-by-side images of rephotography that invite comparison, where you can see the ways in which the views of Yosemite have been codified, but also changes in the environment. So we can see effects of drought and increased forestation in the centuries since indigenous practices of controlled burning were put to an end by white settlers and environmentalists. And so we encourage you, we know that you can't see these images super clearly from this particular image, but we encourage you to come into the gallery and take a closer look and we invite comparison between the Watkins and Adams that we show at left and then the rephotography project at right. And I do hope that many of you will have the chance to come and see Systematic Thinking, which will be on view here at the Yale University Art Gallery through June 25th, 2023. The installation does include additional photographs like portraits and artist books that we were not able to speak about today. So come and take a look. And this concludes the formal part of our conversation. So thank you all for your attention. And we do have some time for questions and answers. So please type any questions that you might have into the Q&A box.
I guess we addressed everything. Okay. How did you decide not to use projection? I'm gonna assume that you mean like video projection or like some kind of illumination. These are photographs in the collection, and so one of the chief aims is also to just show things that we have in the Department of Photography. We have some number like 20,000 or so pictures, and so this is a way to show what we might otherwise not normally show, but also make a claim about this kind of idea of systematic thinking and how systems are shaped by photography, shape photography, vice versa. Oh, they're appearing everywhere. Let's see.
So I see a question about if we're going to be teaching classes in the exhibition, and if so, which disciplines. I'm really looking forward to teaching with this installation, and I'm already planning on teaching a geometry class using the Mel Bochner piece, an environmental studies class using the landscape wall, and I'm looking forward to more interdisciplinary connections.
There is a question about the process of titling the exhibition. I feel like I will just reveal the title comes from a very particular thing that Danielle shared with me about STEM education in K-12 schools. There are a couple of, what are they called? Anchor concepts, Danielle?
Yeah, so this is from the Next Generation Science Standards, the NGSS, which are national science standards for K-12 education, and they're called cross-cutting concepts.
Right. So when we originally came up with an idea to do a rotation together, I asked Danielle about these and she gave me a few of them. And I think the one that I latched onto most was systems. One, because it was interesting to me, but also something that's actually just kind of, in the air in history of photography, like from landscape, from portraiture, from archives. There is a way, perhaps just because you're working with a camera and working with this like technology that's outside of yourself, that, this kind of thing happens. And so that is where it comes from. I think of myself as a pretty systematic thinker, and it's just kind of a pleasant way to describe what we're trying to accomplish here. I have a question here about if we were to expand this, what are some additional artists we would wish to discuss or include? I mean, there are lots of photographers who talk about the landscape. I think that like this is just one particular aspect of it. I think that's something that we did not really address was how much aerial photography there is. I think like something that is really, really relevant is, you know, these are not the photographers in particular, but the work of forensic architecture, this architecture firm in the UK that uses photographic evidence to kind of demonstrate state violence. They do this in the Middle East, but also in Southeast Asia and so forth. So that is one area that I would like to take it if we had a bigger room. Danielle, do you have anything to add on that idea?
Yeah, I think I'll just mention that I'm pretty excited for the Cornelia Parker images that are going to go up halfway through the show. So we have to rotate some images and take them off view because they're too light sensitive to stay up for the entire run of the show. And halfway through in mid-April, I believe, we will be putting up 3 photograms by the British artist Cornelia Parker, and they're photograms of feathers that have gone on really long journeys, like to the summit of Everest or to the North Pole. And I'm looking forward to having those on view. Think about the journeys that tiny objects can take and the narratives that they hold.
Right. That makes me think also of Catherine Wagner, who we had originally discussed as a potential candidate for this exhibition. She has a lot of great photographs of science classrooms, and there's that one you showed me of all those birds in a 7th grade science classroom that I wish we could have included. I have a question here about grids, which is a very kind of, you know, explicit form of systematic thinking. You're right. They show minor variations. And this actually kind of ties into something that just appeared in the chat about mixing paintings and photographs. Is like something I wish we could have gotten to was how material is often an avenue for systematic thinking. I think about a lot of photographers who are cutting up photographs and quilting, like they're kind of cutting them into strips and tying them together. We have some pictures by an artist named Sarah Sense where she's doing this. And then I can think also of a photographer like Lyle Ashton Harris, who is both using his personal archive, but then also new photographs and literally placing them on top of each other. He has a series now, which I think is at the Brandeis Museum of Art, where he is incorporating textiles from his trips in West Africa, along with photographs from his personal archive. Are there other kinds of systematic thinking or processes that are on your mind though, Danielle?
I think I'll mention one of the walls of the installation that we didn't really cover in the talk, which is the portraiture wall, where we have images of the same people at different times. So we have a set by Adrian Piper where she is taking self-portraits over a period of time at which she's reading the work of Immanuel Kant and documenting the changes on her body as she digests that reading. And we also have portraits by Dawood Bey at the moment that show the 3 different images of the same person named Joy that show her face, her hands, and so different thinking about different views of the same person at slightly different times.
I'm not seeing any more questions. I think people are sated.
Great.
Well, thank you all for joining us. This has been a fun afternoon. I hope you have time to see the show. It's a little room, so you can take it in about an hour or so. But thank you all for listening, and have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.